Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Kyle Rudick. I'm a professor in the Communication and Media Department at the University of Northern Iowa. And I'm joined today by Kathryn Golsan, who's an instructor in the department as well. And we're doing a video for Cultivating Justice, a quest towards racial equity. And what we're going to be talking about today is power and race and racism, particularly as it pertains to the U.S. context. So first, I'm just going to ask Kat. So what is power? What do we mean whenever we say power?
Well, what I tell my students to kind of narrow it down in a nutshell situation, it is much bigger than this definition, but I'll give you a simplistic one to get us started.
Okay.
So my definition of power is a person, place, idea, tradition, everyday assumption, etc., with the ability to directly or indirectly influence the behaviors, ideas, course of events, and environment of other people or their surroundings themselves. So it's much bigger than that, and it can mean many different contextual things. But it is the ability to influence those things, whether it is direct or indirectly.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. I mean, whenever I think about power, I think of primarily how power is something that's often invisible to us, that it produces things that oftentimes we're not even aware of. Um, and I think one of those things is, it produces expectations. And whenever those expectations are fulfilled, then we feel like things are normal. And even if they're bad, if it's normal, then oftentimes people don't think
Question it.
about it again, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And if it violates that normalcy, even if you violate what's normal, but it's for the good, people sometimes react against that because they see it change in and of itself as bad. And
Right.
so that sort of day to day, sort of normalcy that people build up really becomes the sort of locus of power, right? That what we expect to be normal or what we expect to happen, whenever it does or doesn't, that's what kind of gets us into trouble a lot of the time. So yeah, let's connect that then to this idea of race and racism. So you're talking about this idea of like things that happen that influence people or ideas or other course of events. So how does power then? What does it have to do with race?
So let's start off then. After we've described kind of what power is in a very simplistic kind of surface way, hopefully we can unpack it a little bit more specifically through talking about race. So, Kyle, let's start with the question: what does power have to do with race?
Yeah, so I think about the sort of the two definitions that we just gave, right? One is the ability to influence things. And so here I think about sort of like oftentimes very obvious ways that racism happens that are an exercise of power, right? So historically speaking, the way that American white Americans have treated people of color, the enslavement of black people,
Mm-hmm.
taking over of indigenous lands, using particularly Chinese labor to create the railroad system. All these different ways in which people of color have been exploited are ways that you have one group of people influencing or changing the behaviors of other people,
Mm-hmm.
um, usually through force or terrorism or other ways that happens. And I also think, coming from my definition of power, how after years or even centuries of that the moment that we have now, racism is so normal, it's so
Mm-hmm.
ingrained, it's so assumed in the system that again, whenever things try to challenge or change that, oftentimes people and more often than not, white Americans react very negatively towards things that try to change that system because it's normal, right? What's
Mm-hmm.
normal for them is for them to be on top of this racial hierarchy that they've created and to continue to either exploit people of color or to at least enjoy the fruits of exploitation that's happened in the past.
Sure. Like everyday examples of that I use in class often are things like the first Thanksgiving, and how that's written from a white standpoint. If you read it from a different standpoint, it is not very, let's say, collaborative.
Yeah.
Different points in history on how things have been built and on whose backs they've been built on, what it's taken to, I don't know, produce better science, for instance. We teach this a lot. The ethics of science or human research has been often in the painful and exploitation of Black people and Indigenous people over white people for sure. And that's historically just documented from the past couple hundred years,
Yeah.
if not the past 50 years. It's still going on today. It still has a lot of effect on certain groups today. So a lot of people don't realize that it's all the time, everywhere, especially in things that they enjoy, like holidays or American dream, those kinds of things. Things that we think are ideals often are very eroded with different historical racisms.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think of again, like how those oftentimes overt ways that racism plays out becomes normalized and then becomes hidden as a part of the normal. So, I grew up in a small town called Ulaga, which is north of Tulsa. And for folks who may have watched Lovecraft Country or what's the other show that's on Amazon Prime, The Watchmen. The Watchmen. A lot of people, whenever they watch those shows for the first time, learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? And I can tell you from my own experience, like I grew up 30 miles away from Tulsa, and that was never taught to us. It wasn't in any of our history books. We didn't learn about it in Oklahoma history class. Like no one talked about this. And it wasn't until much later in life that I read about this account and was like, oh my gosh, that happened literally, a half-hour drive away from where I live. So whenever you think then about how history's been distorted, how things have been hidden, how things have been altered,
retold from the side of the victors often enough.
Right. That creates a type of normalcy for people, particularly white people, because we don't see how that history plays out and how it affects our present moment. And so whenever a movement like Black Lives Matter or other movements for racial equity come along and start trying to point out the problems with the system, a lot of white people's reaction is, oh, there's no problem, because they've been so, in some cases, willfully miseducated that they don't even know how history has put them in the place that they are now.
True, and it becomes very difficult to try to uneducate that part, or at least introduce a more holistic history, because at a young age, learning those kinds of things and then having to relearn them again as an adult, rewrite some of those histories and make it much more, for better or worse, colorful, is a very, very painful process. It can be very uncomfortable. And so we make often enough excuses for it, denials of it, because it is a little hard to grapple with in a very instantaneous moment. It takes a lot of time to let it settle into your system and expand what you already know. But it does make you extremely uncomfortable. And that's part of the process of talking about power and race all the time, because it's not going away. It shouldn't go away. And it's something that we can actually all have a conversation about and do something about, I believe.
Yeah, and I think you really hit the nail on the head whenever you say that we have to talk about it, because oftentimes whenever we're not talking about something, whenever we're not, putting intentional sort of focus on it, it becomes part of the normal.
Right.
Well, what is the normal right now? Well, the normal right now is a system that is it's very inequitable, right? It's very oppressive, particularly towards people of color, um, and particularly towards Black people, right? It's very much targeting these populations. And
Hmm.
so what might be seen as normal, particularly from a white standpoint, again, sort of erases the history that has informed our current moment and is playing out in front of our very eyes.
Hmm. And one of the main things about when we say normal, we can also put in the words, perhaps comfortable is a better word,
Right.
or
Yeah.
often enough when we think or we say the word race or racism in a classroom to just talk about it, there's a huge influx of conflict avoidance. You can feel it happening because of the moment of discomfort, right? You're in a comfortable position as a white person, and all of a sudden you become uncomfortable or unnormal, right? And you immediately think conflict is going to happen. But the more and more we ignore it, the more and more we're likely to see it as a conflictual conversation rather than a collaborative and progressive one that it can be. Often enough, that is the case in classrooms where it becomes very difficult to try to open up this conversation. Both the instructor, if they are white, most likely, will also have that moment of discomfort in their own agency that they have to get past to be able to handle the discomfort of their white students, as well as probably the discomfort of their students of color, which I would definitely think is going to happen as well, just in a different way.
Yeah.
But it's
I
not
think,
conflict that happens. It's just a moment of discomfort.
right. So, I mean, so Kat, whenever we were talking about this, we wanted to sort of ground this in some
Yes.
examples. So, you
Yes.
want to talk a little bit about what that example looks like?
Sure. To start the process, we want to give you an example to help clarify what we're already talking about. So Kyle and I published a research study where we talked to white students specifically about what they thought about politeness in the context of interracial communication. In that project, we asked white students about working with students of color, sharing spaces like the library, the cafeteria, the dormitory, something like that, and interacting with each other on a daily basis. Um, and some of the responses, some of the data that we gathered from that were really alarming and telling to us about everyday basis interracial communication.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll be diving into a response from one of our the participants, which is a white female student that we've decided to call Carol, which is not her real name, of course, to show you all what we mean about white supremacy and white racial power in an everyday basis. So,
yeah. So, what we want you to do now is open up the document that accompanied this video, and you'll want to read through the document of an interview that happened between me and Carol as we were talking about her ideas about race and racism and interracial communication. Before you do that, though, let me just reiterate a caution warning here. Some of the things that she says are very racist and are very negative. And so, before, you might want to mentally prepare yourself before reading the document. Okay. So just keep that in mind before you choose to continue reading. So I'm going to ask you now to pause the video and to read that document and then start it back up once you've finished. All right. So let's talk about how the responses from Carol connect to this idea of power, particularly within the context of race.
Does that mean?
Yeah.
So let's take the example from lines 24 to 26. I'll wait for a second so you can find that one. Starts with Carol, and she says, Kyle first asked her, if you don't mind, do you have a story at the time, or maybe he said something and you said something back or didn't say something. She says, oh, plenty. He'll just randomly say the N-word. They don't always use the crosswalks here, is so he'll suddenly have to stop around campus, like at crosswalks, not even 10 feet away. He'll just blare out the N-word, and it's embarrassing. I'm like, stop it. And he's like, no. So this, for her, is a common experience that she's had with this particular boyfriend. And apparently a common thing he does all the time on campus. If we dig into this response a little bit, we can see how power is used in a specific language way. This response shows how the use of language is meant to instill the power to influence a behavioral change in students of color. It is meant to shame or embarrass and or assimilate them into a more whitewashed environment that makes the white boyfriend feel more comfortable and legitimized in that space. So power is being used to suffocate a different culture through a language choice, a specific word to keep them smaller in that environment than he is. So he feels more comfortable, again, normalized in that specific environment.
Yeah,
that powerful word changes something.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how how the violence in that language, right, is meant to like tell people of color, in this case, in particular, Black people, right, that you shouldn't be a part of this
space
campus, right, that you shouldn't be a part of this space, right, like it makes you feel unwelcome or maybe even intimidated or threatened by that. Yeah, so whenever I'm looking at the data, you know, I really kind of focused in on the lines 63 through 64, where she talks about. So I asked her, right? So if you were to get married and you had kids, would you change the way that you interacted with your boyfriend about his racist behaviors? And she says no, and ask why. And she says, well, it's only here at school. He's fine until he came to college, where we are around the majority of them. Everywhere else, it's fine. It's when they do something that makes him mad or something. And what's interesting to me about this is how she has created her boyfriend as a victim, even though he's the perpetrator in this scenario, right? So he grew up in a town that was almost all white. He came to a campus where there was racial diversity. There were other people of color, Black people, who were sharing spaces with him. And his reaction to that was to not only denigrate, as you pointed out, Black people, but to make their very presence as a threat to him that he needed to do something about, that he wouldn't be racist if he wasn't around them, making him racist. Which is a really interesting sort of flipping of the script. And so it's like just being around diverse people, right, is itself racist because it makes him feel uncomfortable, and thus his reaction is violent.
That everyday discomfort, that moment of physical change that he's feeling within, is probably in some ways a fight or flight simulation going on, because if he's never been around people of color before, right, he has no idea how to react, or with himself being uncomfortable. It has nothing to do with anything around him. It's himself all of a sudden feels uncomfortable because he's not used to being in an environment where he doesn't see people just like himself.
Yeah.
It's no excuse for that.
No.
At all.
And that's what's interesting is, you know, I think typically people in education, you know, at all levels, but particularly in colleges, we think to ourselves, oh, you know, what you need to do is, you know, make sure that people from different racial or ethnic groups come together, and that will solve racism.
Right.
And there is some research that shows that, like, you know,
it normalizes
people
things
very intentionally and with a lot of support can do that. But what
the earlier the better. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
The earlier the better, right?
Right.
The more normal everyday things, the better.
Yeah. But what this shows is that, like, for some white people, they are so invested in this normalcy of being in all white spaces that just being confronted with the opportunity to be around people of color is threatening to them. And they not only want to expel that people of color, right? They want to make sure that they're not sharing the same spaces, and they do that through things like calling them names, right? Making them feel unwanted and uncomfortable. But then at the same time, painting themselves as the victim.
Right.
I don't do this. You make me do this by your presence.
So power in that moment is fluctuating in this person.
Yeah.
That there's a moment where he probably feels my power is being taken away, or something's influencing me because I feel so different, and therefore I feel afraid or angry or whatever it may be that comes up. Therefore, I must flex my own power in this moment and make it bigger than that power to influence or change back the environment to my own comfort level.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening.
You've really sort of weaponized your own discomfort. You've weaponized your own like self-victimhood, so that way you feel justified in doing racist things.
Right. You said they are doing it to him. If it wasn't for them,
right,
that their power or potential, right, that power differentiation, he wouldn't have to re-up his own power, like just by being in the same space, not even actually doing anything.
Right. And so, so as you all are reading through that document, we encourage you to find other instances where in Carol's story, it exhibits these types of power, right? Either places where what she's saying or how you think she might act based on what she's saying indicates that she believes that that white people should be doing things to influence other people, particularly in this case, people of color and Black people, make them feel small, make them feel minimized, make them feel unwelcome, right? And then also, where do you see that Carol's expectations of normalcy or comfort, as Kat was saying earlier, right? Where do those things show that she has been, where her expectations lead her to justify very bad behavior, very racist behaviors,
right?
Because it supports her sense of normalcy, even if that normalcy is deeply erroneous and deeply racist.
So often enough, she's very silent, or will be silent, silently supportive in a way of his actions, because she won't say anything about it, won't do anything about it. Even if she isn't comfortable with the action that's happening, whether it's because it's a spectacle or because she's actually uncomfortable with the racial parts of it, she silences consent kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Situation, and she agrees with it later on. So how does that whiteness support more whiteness on the process? Power of agency that she has, she gives up. So in some ways. So at this point, we want to leave you with maybe a couple questions to kind of reflect on past this particular assignment that we have given you in this moment. Things that you can talk about with each other. Feel free to, find us and talk about with us, because we of course, we'll talk about it all the time. What are some questions you would like to leave them with on this everyday basis, power and race? I would say, what kind of language do you hear on a daily basis, particularly maybe in meetings? Often enough, I hear instructors talk about students by just in just everyday conversation. They'll use they language a lot, them, if they didn't do this to themselves, those kinds of things. Can you identify some of those things that you hear almost normally? Those are usually things that have been silenced. So can you come up with a couple yourself that you have heard in the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, and I also encourage you all to think about, again, what is normal for you, right? What are the expectations that you have for talking to other people, and how do those reflect on yourself? And to think, if I'm not building deep relationships, friendships, collaborations, mentorships with people who are from different racial or ethnic identities from myself. What does that say about me? And what can I do to disrupt what has been very normal in my life, which is to cut those relationships off, or to not cultivate them, or to challenge myself to think about why my actions and the way that things that I believe might in some ways be the reason for that. And then to start that trajectory of growth then towards finding, ways of building relationships that are authentic and affirming, across different races and across different ethnicities.
Right. So we just want to thank you guys for coming this week and watching this video and doing this week's assignment. We hope that you are enjoying at least, or finding some deep sense of meaning within the Cultivating Justice, a Quest Towards Racial Equity project. Feel free to get in contact with us or Danielle if you have additional questions. We'd love to hear about them. And we hope you continue with this journey.